On a quiet morning in an English village, a door remained closed while the world carried on outside. No alarm was raised, no voice called for help, yet something unseen had already shifted. In places like this, certainty settles quickly and questions arrive late. Tonight, we listen closely, not for noise, but for the small, ordinary details that quietly change everything within a village shaped by habit and hidden fear. Chapter 1. Morning in St Aldwyn arrived gently the way it always did, without insistence and without apology. The village woke as if stirred by habit rather than sound. Curtains were drawn back. Kettles were filled. A single bus passed through the high street, carrying no one who lived there, and stopping for no one who did. Miss Marple was already awake. She always was, not because she had slept badly, but because she preferred to greet the day before it had fully decided what sort of day it intended to be. She sat by the window, with her knitting resting in her lap, watching the slow movement of light across the opposite hedge. Across the lane, Mrs. Finch was hanging out washing. It was far too early for such diligence. Miss Marple noticed this. Mrs. Finch normally waited until the church bell rang 8. Today there was no bell, and still the washing went up. Something had shifted. Not loudly. Not visibly. But enough. The knock came just after 7:30. It was tentative, as though the person knocking had not yet decided whether it was appropriate to disturb anyone at all. Miss Marple rose at once. She did not hurry. People who knocked like that often needed time to speak. It was Mrs. Grant from Willow End. Her hat was crooked and she was breathing too quickly. Her gloves were on the wrong hands. "I hope I am not troubling you, Miss Marple." "You are never troubling me, dear. Come in." Mrs. Grant did not sit. She stood by the table, twisting the strap of her handbag. "It is Mr. Hawthorne. They have found him." Miss Marple said nothing. She waited. The silence allowed Mrs. Grant to continue without interruption. He did not come down for breakfast. Mrs. Linton went up to knock, and there was no answer. The door was locked. From the inside, Miss Marple's needles paused. Her eyes remained on the woman's face. They broke the door? No. The key was inside. In the lock. They used the spare. Of course. Mrs. Grant swallowed. He was in the chair, as though he had simply fallen asleep. And he had not. No. Miss Marple rose and fetched her coat. She did not ask permission. She did not ask whether she should come. In villages like St. Aldwyn, one did not wait to be invited into grief. One arrived quietly and made tea. The house at Willow End was already full when they arrived. Not full of noise, but of presence. People stood where they did not usually stand. They whispered where no whisper was needed. Mr. Hawthorne's room was upstairs at the back. The landing smelled faintly of lavender and polish. Miss Marple noticed that the rug by the door was slightly folded at one corner, as though it had been nudged more than once. The door itself stood open now. The lock had been damaged by the spare key. Miss Marple examined it briefly before entering. The room was neat. Too neat. Everything was in its place in a way that suggested effort rather than habit. Mr. Hawthorne sat in the chair by the window, his hands folded loosely, his head inclined as if listening. The doctor stood nearby, already finished with his work. No sign of violence, Miss Marple. Heart failure, most likely. And the door, locked from the inside. Windows bolted. No one else present. Several people nodded at this, as though the matter were now settled. Miss Marple did not nod. She walked slowly around the room. She did not touch anything. She rarely did. Things spoke more clearly when left undisturbed. She noticed the tea tray by the bed. 1 cup. Clean. 2. Clean. The saucer bore no stain. The teaspoon lay unused. "Did he usually take tea in the morning?" she asked. Mrs. Linton answered quickly. "Always. At 7 sharp. And today, I prepared it as usual. But he did not drink it." Mrs. Linton looked uncertain. Perhaps he intended to later. Miss Marple nodded gently. Perhaps. She moved to the window. It was bolted firmly. The bolt showed signs of frequent use. This was not new. On the mantelpiece stood a clock. It had stopped at 6:20. Is the clock broken? No, Mrs. Grant said. It keeps good time. Miss Marple did not comment. She looked at the chair. It was slightly angled not directly toward the window, but away from it. He preferred the light, Mrs. Linton said, as if defending the room itself. I am sure he did. Outside the bell began to ring at last. 8:00. Late. Miss Marple looked at the door again. The inside key hung slightly downward as if it had been turned and left rather than carefully placed. Locked rooms were comforting to people. They suggested certainty. Miss Marple had learned long ago that certainty was often the most dangerous thing of all. The village absorbed the news the way dry ground absorbs rain, without sound but with consequence. By mid-morning, everyone knew. By midday, everyone knew what they believed had happened. Mr. Hawthorne had lived alone since his sister's death. He was private, but not unkind. Precise but predictable. A man who locked doors because he always had. A man who drank his tea at 7 because that was what he did. Locked from the inside. The phrase passed from mouth to mouth as though it were a conclusion rather than a description. Miss Marple returned home before noon. She did not linger at Willow End. There was nothing more the room would say until the people around it began to speak more freely. She resumed her seat by the window. Her knitting moved again, slowly, steadily. Mrs. Finch crossed the lane once more. This time she did not hang washing. She spoke to Mrs. Peters instead. Their heads bent together. They did not look toward Miss Marple's house. That in itself was notable. At 12:30 the post arrived. Among the letters was one addressed to Mr. Hawthorne. Miss Marple recognized the handwriting. It was from his nephew. The postman hesitated. I suppose I should take it back. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. That would be best. She held the envelope for a moment longer than necessary before returning it. The handwriting was firm, confident, recently written. At 1:00, Mrs. Grant arrived again. This time she sat. They say it was natural, yes. They say there is nothing to be done, yes. And yet, Miss Marple smiled faintly. And yet doors are locked for reasons, dear, and sometimes not for the reasons people think. Mrs. Grant leaned forward. Do you think someone else was there? I think someone else has been thought away. Mrs. Grant did not understand. That was all right. Understanding would come later. In the afternoon, Miss Marple walked past Willow End alone. The curtains in the upstairs room were now drawn. The house looked smaller somehow, as though it had folded inward. She noticed the side gate was open. It was rarely left that way. She paused, then continued. That evening the village gathered not officially, but instinctively. People drifted toward one another carrying plates and explanations. He locked himself in. There was no sound. No one could have entered. Each statement added another layer to the door. Miss Marple listened. She drank her tea. She watched hands when people spoke. Some were steady, some were not. The clock at Willow End had stopped at 6:20. That troubled her, not because clocks stopped, but because people noticed when they did. She recalled Mrs. Linton's certainty. 7 sharp. Certainty was comforting. It saved people from asking questions they did not wish to answer. Miss Marple returned home as the light faded. She did not turn on the lamp immediately. She sat in the dark listening to the sounds of the village settling into night. Doors closed. Windows latched. Locks turned. She smiled faintly. The door at Willow End had been locked from the inside. That much was true. But truth had many rooms. And not all of them required keys. Chapter 2. By the next morning, St Aldwyn had dressed the death in its Sunday clothes and set it on a shelf where it could be stared at without touching. People did that with unsettling things. They framed them. They labeled them. They placed them at a safe distance, and called that understanding. Miss Marple walked to the high street just after 9. The air held the thin bite of late autumn. Leaves lay in neat drifts along the curb, as though the village itself had swept them there to keep its pavements respectable. The sky was pale and careful. Even the sun looked as if it did not wish to intrude. The newsagent's bell rang softly as she entered. But it was not the bell that drew attention. It was the pause that followed it. Conversations did not stop entirely. They merely shifted direction, like a curtain tugged slightly aside. Mr. Ellis, who ran the shop, looked up from behind the counter with the air of a man who had already said the same sentence 6 times and was ready to say it again. "Morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning, Mr. Ellis." He passed her the paper without being asked. She accepted it politely and placed it in her bag untouched. She had not come for headlines. She had come for faces. "Sad business," Mr. Ellis continued, as if duty required it. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "No one can understand it, though. Locked from the inside. Doctor says heart. Poor chap." 2 customers near the sweets display nodded with relief, as though a doctor's opinion had not only diagnosed a death, but disinfected it. Miss Marple bought a small packet of biscuits and left. Outside, she walked more slowly than necessary. People who wished to speak to you often needed the comfort of catching up. She reached the butcher's and saw Mrs. Peters standing near the window, pretending to study sausages, while her eyes darted toward the street. "Miss Marple," she said quickly, as though the name had escaped her without permission. "Have you heard?" "I have heard a little." Mrs. Peters lowered her voice, though no one was close enough to hear. "It is Mr. Hawthorne. They say he simply died in his chair. But you know what is strange? The door," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Peters' expression sharpened. "Yes. Locked from the inside. And do you know what else? Mrs. Linton says he had been particularly particular lately. Locking things twice. Checking the windows more than usual. As though he was frightened." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People often become more careful as winter approaches." Mrs. Peters leaned closer. "Not like this. He asked her 3 times last week if she had seen anyone lingering by the hedge. Did she? No. But she did not like it. Mrs. Linton does not like anything that feels unusual. She says it upsets her digestion." Miss Marple nodded. That sounded like Mrs. Linton. And then Mrs. Peters continued, "There is the matter of his nephew." Miss Marple kept her face calm. "What matter is that?" Mrs. Peters hesitated in the way people do when they are about to enjoy themselves. "He wrote, apparently, or rang. Something. There was talk of money. People say he wanted Mr. Hawthorne to change his will, and Mr. Hawthorne refused. They say he was angry about it. Who says this?" Mrs. Peters' eyes flicked away. "Oh, you know. People. Mr. Ellis mentioned it. So did Mrs. Finch. She heard it from the vicar's wife. The vicar's wife always knows." Miss Marple did not correct her. Information had a way of improving itself as it traveled. Like soup. Like gossip. She thanked Mrs. Peters and continued. At the corner of the green, she paused by the flower stall. Mrs. Dalloway, who sold bunches of chrysanthemums and always looked as though she wished to sell sympathy as well, greeted her with a soft sigh. "Such a shock, Miss Marple. A great shock." "I keep thinking of that room," Mrs. Dalloway said, lowering her voice. "So tidy. So still. It gave me a chill. It was as though the house itself had decided to keep him." Miss Marple chose a small bunch of flowers and waited. People spoke more freely when their hands were busy. "They say it must have been his heart," Mrs. Dalloway continued. "But I do not like things that are too neat. Life is not neat. Death is rarely neat. Unless someone has made it so." Miss Marple's eyes lifted briefly. "Do you think someone did?" Mrs. Dalloway pressed her lips together. "I should not say. But the window was bolted, and the door locked. If someone did it, They were clever. Or lucky, Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Dalloway did not hear. She was already drifting toward another thought. And did you notice, she added, Mrs. Linton was wearing her Sunday brooch yesterday. The pearl one. She only wears that when she wishes people to think she is respectable. Miss Marple accepted the flowers and paid. Respectability is useful in a village. It is like a fence. It keeps certain things out and keeps certain things in. When Miss Marple returned home, she found a visitor waiting on her doorstep. It was the vicar, Reverend Hargreaves, a kind man with a worried brow and hands that always looked as if they were trying to smooth invisible creases from the air. Miss Marple, he said, I do hope I am not interrupting. Not at all. Come in. He accepted tea with the gratitude of a man who had been offered a warm chair in a cold wind. He held his cup carefully as though it contained something holy. I visited Willow End this morning, he said. Mrs. Linton is quite overcome. She has been in that house for years, you know. She speaks of it as though it is part of her body. She would, Miss Marple said. The vicar hesitated. There is something else. The constable was there. They are treating it as natural. But he asked a few questions all the same. Because of the locked door, Miss Marple's hands moved over her knitting. It would be foolish not to ask. Yes. And there is the will. People have begun whispering. I fear it will become unpleasant. It often does, Miss Marple said softly. Unpleasantness rarely needs encouragement. It grows well on its own. The vicar looked pained. The nephew is expected tomorrow. Mr. Hawthorne's only close relative. He is coming to make arrangements. Miss Marple looked up. And do you know what sort of man he is? The vicar sighed. I met him once at Christmas. Charming. Polite. Very attentive. The sort of man one trusts quickly. Miss Marple's smile was gentle. That is sometimes a fault in us, is it not? The vicar stared into his tea as though hoping it might offer an answer. Mrs. Linton said something odd. She said Mr. Hawthorne insisted on locking his door at night, even though there was no reason. She said he was afraid of being made to sign something. Miss Marple's knitting paused for a moment. Did she say when he began to fear that? Only recently. A month, perhaps. After a letter arrived. Miss Marple nodded. Letters could frighten people more than footsteps. After the vicar left, Miss Marple sat quietly for some time. The village sounds drifted through the window. A child called. A dog barked once, and then stopped. Miss Marple thought of the stopped clock at 6:20. She thought of the clean teacup. She thought of Mrs. Linton's certainty. Then she rose, and took from her shelf a small notebook. She wrote down 3 things. The clock, the tea, the letter. She did not yet know how they belonged together. But she could feel, as she often could, that they did. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked toward Willow End again. Not because she wished to intrude, but because she had learned long ago that grief did not remain still. It moved through a house. It changed the air. It made small habits shift. The lane leading to Willow End was lined with bare branches and hedges clipped square. It was a respectable lane. That was what people said when they meant that nothing improper ought to happen there. Willow End itself was a solid house of mellow brick, the sort of house that seemed to have been built to outlast human drama. The front garden was trimmed. The path was swept. A wreath of late autumn leaves hung on the door, as if the seasons were being politely acknowledged, even at a time like this. Miss Marple knocked. After a moment, Mrs. Linton opened the door. Her eyes were red, but her posture was stiff. She looked as though she believed tears were acceptable only if they did not alter one's routine. Miss Marple, she said, with the strained politeness of someone who felt she ought to offer hospitality, even while resenting the need to do so. How kind of you. I thought you might like a little company, Miss Marple said. And perhaps a cup of tea? Mrs. Linton led her into the sitting room. The room smelled of lemon polish and something faintly sour, as though sadness had a taste. The curtains were drawn, though it was still day. Miss Marple sat and waited. Mrs. Linton poured tea with hands that did not tremble. That, Miss Marple thought, was either strength or practice. "I suppose you have come because people talk," Mrs. Linton said abruptly. "I came because you have been alone in that house for many years," Miss Marple replied, "and because alone can feel louder than a crowd." Mrs. Linton's mouth tightened. "There is no mystery, if that is what you mean." Doctor said Hart. The constable said the door was locked from the inside. He said that proves nothing suspicious happened. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Did the constable say that? Yes. And do you believe him? Mrs. Linton stared at her cup. I want to. I very much want to. Miss Marple said nothing. Wanting was often more revealing than believing. I found him, Mrs. Linton said suddenly. Well, not found. I went up because he did not come down. He always came down. Always. 7 sharp. He would sit at the table and read his paper. He liked his toast a certain way. He would complain if it was too pale. Miss Marple's voice was soft. And that morning he did not complain. No. He did not come down. And you knocked. Yes. Several times. I called his name. There was no answer. Then I tried the handle and it would not turn. The key was in the lock inside. I could see it through the keyhole shadow. It was locked. Miss Marple tilted her head. Could you see it clearly? Mrs. Linton looked defensive. Of course I could. I have eyes. I did not mean to doubt you, Miss Marple said gently. I only ask because sometimes we see what we expect to see when we are frightened. Mrs. Linton stiffened. I was not frightened. Miss Marple's needles clicked quietly. No, of course not. There was a pause. Outside, a cart passed, wheels crunching on gravel. The sound was ordinary and therefore comforting. Mrs. Linton spoke again, quieter now. He had been uneasy lately. He kept saying people wanted things from him. He said people were always polite when they wanted something. He said it made him tired. Miss Marple nodded. Did he say who? No. He did not like names. He said names made things real. Miss Marple's eyes lowered to the carpet. And did you notice anything unusual in his room? Mrs. Linton hesitated, then shrugged with the air of someone dismissing a thought she did not wish to entertain. There was the clock. It had stopped. That was odd. He liked that clock. He wound it. At what time was it stopped? Mrs. Linton frowned as if she disliked being asked to remember details. 6:20. And when did you last see it working? The night before. At what time? Mrs. Linton opened her mouth, then closed it. She pressed her lips together. I do not know, she said finally. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. That is quite all right. Mrs. Linton's eyes flickered toward the stairs and then away. There was also the tea tray. I made it, as usual, at 7. I set it outside his door. You did not take it in, no. He liked to open his door and take it himself, and did he always lock his door after? Yes, Mrs. Linton said quickly. Always. He liked his privacy. Miss Marple's knitting paused again. Did he lock it from the inside while you were still upstairs? Mrs. Linton frowned. What do you mean, I mean? Would you hear him turn the key? Mrs. Linton's face changed slightly. A tiny flicker of uncertainty. I did not listen for it, she said sharply. It was none of my business. No, Miss Marple murmured. Not at all. Mrs. Linton's hand tightened around her cup. People think because I am his housekeeper I know everything. But I did not. He did not tell me. He kept himself apart. He was not a man who shared. And yet he trusted you, Miss Marple said. Trust is not always loud. Mrs. Linton's eyes softened for a moment before stiffening again. I have lived here 15 years. I did not come for gossip. I came for work. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Work can be a shelter. Mrs. Linton's gaze dropped. The constable asked if anyone came to the house yesterday morning. No one did. Not until later. The postman came, but he did not knock. He never does. He leaves letters. And there was a letter yesterday. Mrs. Linton looked up sharply. How do you know that? Miss Marple's tone stayed gentle. I saw one addressed to Mr. Hawthorne. The postman hesitated. Mrs. Linton's face tightened. From his nephew. Yes, he has been writing more often, Mrs. Linton said, and there was something bitter underneath her words. Always polite, always kind, always asking after Mr. Hawthorne's health, always suggesting that perhaps Mr. Hawthorne should make things easier. For the future. Miss Marple placed her cup down carefully. And did Mr. Hawthorne like that? Mrs. Linton's laugh was short. He hated it. He said kindness that asks is worse than cruelty that demands. Miss Marple nodded slowly. A very perceptive man. When Miss Marple rose to leave, Mrs. Linton followed her to the door. At the threshold, Miss Marple paused and looked back at the stairs. I am sorry for your loss, she said, and for your shock. Mrs. Linton's voice was quiet now. It was not shock at the death. Death comes. It was the door. Miss Marple's eyes met hers. Yes. The door, Mrs. Linton whispered as if confessing. Locked from the inside. It felt like the house was hiding something, like it did not want us to come in. Miss Marple stepped out into the cold afternoon. She walked slowly down the path. She did not look back. The village wanted the locked door to mean safety. It wanted it to mean that nothing wicked had slipped in. But Miss Marple could already feel the shape of a different truth. Sometimes the most dangerous thing was not that a door could be opened. It was that everyone believed it could not. Chapter 3. The third day after Mr. Hawthorne's death arrived with a peculiar sort of calm, the kind that followed a village decision. The decision had been made quietly, without vote or meeting, yet everyone seemed to know it. They would mourn. They would speak kindly. They would accept the doctor's conclusion. They would let the locked door become a comforting phrase, something that proved safety rather than questioned it. Miss Marple did not argue with decisions like that. She simply watched what they cost. She walked to Willow End in the late morning, when the sun was high enough to make shadows honest. The lane was busy in its polite way. People were sweeping steps that did not need sweeping. People were trimming hedges that had been trimmed only last week. It was an old habit of villages, to tidy the world when the heart felt untidy. At Willow End, a small black car stood near the gate. The constable had returned. He was young, earnest, and always slightly too clean, as if he believed dirt was a sign of moral failure. He saw Miss Marple and gave her a respectful nod. Morning, Miss Marple. Good morning, constable. He looked mildly relieved, as though the presence of an elderly woman with knitting needles made death feel less like his responsibility. I am just checking details again. Procedure, you know. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Procedure is a comfort. He hesitated, then added, Mrs. Linton is upstairs. She is helping the undertaker with some personal effects. I told her she should not, but she insisted. Some people need to be useful. Miss Marple's eyes lifted toward the upstairs window. The curtains were open today, and the light looked thin. May I go up for a moment? She asked. The constable shifted, uncertain, torn between instruction and instinct. It is not a crime scene, Miss Marple. Not officially. The doctor signed the paper. But still. Still, Miss Marple echoed gently. He sighed. All right. But I would prefer if you did not touch anything. I rarely do, she said. Upstairs, the landing held the same clean smell of lavender and polish. Yet Miss Marple noticed at once that the air was different. It was heavier, as though the house were holding its breath. Grief did that. It made rooms feel smaller. Mrs. Linton stood near the wardrobe with a stack of folded shirts in her arms. The undertaker waited by the doorway, solemn and patient. Mrs. Linton's face tightened when she saw Miss Marple. She seemed to interpret every visitor as a kind of accusation. I suppose you have come to stare, she said. I have come to help you carry something, Miss Marple replied simply. Mrs. Linton blinked, caught off balance by the ordinary offer. For a moment, she looked almost human again. I can manage, she said. And then, as if the words had sounded too harsh, she added, It is kind of you. Miss Marple nodded and stepped into the room. In the daylight, it looked less like a mystery and more like a life that had been carefully arranged. The chair by the window was still there. The rug still folded slightly at one corner. The mantel clock had been removed now and placed on the dresser, as though someone had been offended by its silence. Miss Marple moved toward the door first. She studied the lock without touching it. The key was no longer inside. The constable had likely removed it for his report, or perhaps Mrs. Linton had done so because the sight of it unsettled her. Where is the key? Miss Marple asked. The constable glanced at the dresser. In an envelope. For the record, I can show it to you. He opened the envelope carefully and let her see it resting there, an ordinary brass key. Nothing dramatic. Nothing theatrical. The sort of thing one could hold in a palm and forget. It was in the lock, Miss Marple said. Yes. Mrs. Linton says she saw it in the lock through the keyhole. Mrs. Linton lifted her chin. I did. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Did you see it before or after you used the spare key? Before, Mrs. Linton replied quickly. From the landing, Miss Marple asked, or close to the door? Mrs. Linton frowned. Close, of course. I was right there. Miss Marple nodded, as though accepting it, but her eyes moved to the keyhole itself. The metal around it bore the faintest scuff marks, not fresh scratches, but the sort of marks that came from frequent, careful contact. A hand? A tool? A ring? She looked away without comment and turned her attention to the rug. The rug was a small one, meant to soften footsteps. It was old, but well cared for. The fold in the corner was still there, the same corner, as though it had been nudged by something repeatedly, and always from the same direction. What do you do with the vacuum? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Linton stared. I beg your pardon. Your vacuum, Miss Marple repeated calmly. Do you keep it in the cupboard upstairs or downstairs? Mrs. Linton looked baffled, then irritated. Downstairs. Of course. And when you clean this landing, do you move this rug? Yes, Mrs. Linton snapped. I am not careless. So the fold is new, Miss Marple said softly. The constable looked up. What fold? Miss Marple did not answer him yet. She moved to the chair. The chair was positioned so that Mr. Hawthorne, sitting as he had been found, would not have been looking straight out at the garden. He would have been looking slightly to the side, toward the corner of the room, where there was nothing except a small table and a vase. Did he always sit like this? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Linton tightened again. He sat there every morning. Yes, Miss Marple said. But did he always turn the chair like that? Mrs. Linton hesitated. A tiny pause. The smallest thing. But it was there. I do not know, she said at last, which in Mrs. Linton's language meant, I do not want to know. Miss Marple walked to the small table by the chair. It held a book, closed, and a pair of spectacles placed neatly on top. The spectacles were aligned perfectly, like an instruction. The book was a gardening manual. Miss Marple did not pick it up. She could see the page marker, a simple strip of paper, lying at a place halfway through. But the pages near the marker were not bent, not softened by fingers. They looked untouched. She moved to the tea tray near the bed. It was still there, though the cup had been taken away. The tray looked clean. Too clean. Miss Marple noticed the faint round marks where the cup had stood, like pale circles on wood. Did you wash the cup? She asked. Mrs. Linton's voice was stiff. Yes. I did not see why it should sit there. It was upsetting. It would be, Miss Marple agreed. Did he take sugar? Mrs. Linton frowned as though she disliked the memory of his preferences. Sometimes. And this morning Miss Marple asked, "Did you put sugar on the tray?" Mrs. Linton's mouth opened, then closed. Again that tiny pause, the smallest wobble in routine. "I do not remember," she said. Miss Marple nodded as if she had expected exactly that. She turned to the window and studied the bolt. The bolt was old, slightly tarnished, but it moved smoothly. There were faint scratches on the wood beside it, not deep, not violent, but suggestive of something sliding against the frame. The constable followed her gaze. "We checked that. Bolted from the inside. No way to open from outside." Miss Marple's eyes remained on the bolt. "It is a well-loved bolt," she murmured. "And yet the wood has marks that look newer than the rest." The constable shifted again. "Marks can happen. People open and close windows." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "People do." She leaned slightly toward the glass. The window did not look out to the lane. It looked to the back garden, where an old yew hedge formed a private boundary. Beyond it was a narrow strip of land, and then the field. From this window a person could see the hedge, could see if someone walked close to it, could also see the side gate. Miss Marple pictured Mr. Hawthorne standing here, watching, checking. Bolting the window, not because of weather, but because of worry, she turned slowly and let her gaze drift over the wardrobe, the dresser, the bed. The bed looked untouched. The cover was smooth. There were no signs of a hurried night. No crease of someone sitting, no corner pulled back. "Did Mr. Hawthorne sleep here last night?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Linton stiffened. "Of course he did." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "How do you know?" "Because he always did," Mrs. Linton said sharply. Miss Marple looked at her gently. "Always is a word we use when we do not want to examine yesterday." Mrs. Linton flushed. The undertaker kept his eyes lowered, pretending not to listen. The constable looked suddenly uncomfortable, as though he wished he were anywhere else. Miss Marple walked back toward the door and paused at the rug again. The fold was slight, but she could see how it might be caused. A door opening and closing, perhaps, catching the corner each time, nudging it just enough, or something being dragged lightly across it. Not heavy, not a body, something smaller. A tray? A small table? A suitcase? She did not say it aloud. She merely noted it inside. Then she looked at the lock again. The keyhole. The scuff marks, the faint wear around the metal. Locks were like people. They bore the marks of how they were treated. "Constable," Miss Marple said. "May I ask, who has a spare key to this room?" "The spare was kept downstairs," he replied, "in a drawer in the kitchen." "Mrs. Linton showed me. Did anyone else know it was there?" Mrs. Linton lifted her chin. "It is my drawer. I keep it." Miss Marple smiled gently. "And you have never told anyone?" Mrs. Linton's eyes narrowed. "No." Miss Marple nodded. She did not accuse. She did not suggest. She simply watched. Because what people denied often mattered more than what they admitted. When she left Willow End that day, she did so with the same calm steps. The village wind touched her face lightly. Somewhere a bird called once, and then fell silent. The room had not spoken loudly. It had not offered a dramatic clue. It had only shown her what it wanted people to believe. Neatness. Certainty. A locked door. And yet, beneath the tidiness, there were small signs of movement. A folded rug corner. A chair angled away. Marks near a bolt. Scuffs around a keyhole. The room was not silent. It was careful. In the early evening, Miss Marple visited Mr. Barrow, the village carpenter, who lived at the edge of St. Aldwyn in a cottage that always smelled of wood shavings and old tea. Mr. Barrow was not a man who cared for gossip, but he cared deeply for things that fit together properly. Doors. Hinges. Locks. He respected a mechanism more than a rumor. He answered the door with sawdust on his sleeves and a puzzled look. "Miss Marple, this is a surprise. I wonder if you might help me with a small question, she said. He stepped aside at once. Some men found it hard to refuse a calm, elderly woman who asked politely. Inside, his sitting room was crowded with tools and half-finished projects. A chair with a broken leg leaned against the wall like a patient waiting for surgery. Miss Marple sat and accepted a cup of tea that tasted faintly of varnish, but she did not mind. I am not here to talk about feelings, she said gently. Only about a lock. Mr. Barrow's face softened. He leaned back. Willow End, yes, he nodded slowly. Solid house. Solid doors. Old work. Better than most of what you see now. Miss Marple looked at him with mild interest. And the lock on Mr. Hawthorne's room. Do you know it? I fitted a new latch for it last winter, he said. The old one was sticking. A new latch, Miss Marple repeated. Yes. The lock is old, but the latch plate and the mechanism inside the door were worn. Mrs. Linton complained about it. Said Mr. Hawthorne hated fuss. He wanted the door to close quietly. Miss Marple's eyes remained calm. Did you keep the old parts? Mr. Barrow pointed toward a small tin on a shelf. Probably in there somewhere. He stood and rummaged, then brought the tin to the table. Inside were screws, small plates, odd metal pieces, all like bones from different creatures. He found a thin latch piece and held it up. That was the old one. See, worn. The tongue did not sit flush. Miss Marple studied it without touching. Would that cause the door to catch the rug? Mr. Barrow blinked. Rug. The rug outside the room, Miss Marple said. The corner is folded slightly as though nudged. Mr. Barrow frowned. If the door dragged a little, it could, especially if it did not swing clean. And did the door drag? Miss Marple asked. It did sometimes, he admitted. Old frame. Swells and damp. But I fixed most of it when I replaced the latch. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So the door could have been opened and closed several times without anyone noticing a great sound, especially if someone was careful. Mr. Barrow shrugged. Doors can be quiet if you know how to handle them. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Tell me, she said, about that lock. The key, the way it turns. Mr. Barrow leaned forward now, interested, because at last they were speaking his language. It is a simple mortise lock. Old style. Key goes in, turns, throws the bolt, straight forward, and when the key is in the lock on the inside, Miss Marple asked, Can you see it through the keyhole from the outside? Mr. Barrow nodded. If the light is right. You might see the metal, a shadow of it. And if there were no key, Miss Marple said, would someone still think they saw one if they expected to? Mr. Barrow stared. That depends on the person. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. It does. She paused, then continued gently. Now suppose someone wanted the door to appear locked from the inside. Suppose they wanted a person outside the room to look through the keyhole and believe there was a key there. Is there a way? Mr. Barrow rubbed his chin. You mean without leaving a key, yes. He frowned. Not easily. But there are tricks. What kind of tricks? He hesitated. He did not like admitting that his respectable work could be fooled. Some locks, he said slowly, can be turned with a thin tool if the internal bit is worn. Not opened, mind. But the turn can be mimicked. If you have the right piece. And could you push something into the keyhole that looks like a key? Miss Marple asked. Just enough to cast a shadow. Mr. Barrow's eyes sharpened. A sliver of metal, a bent nail, a filed strip. Yes, you could. You could make a person think the key is inside if they are already in a panic. Miss Marple nodded. She felt something settle into place. Would that leave marks? Mr. Barrow's expression tightened. It could. Around the keyhole. Small scuffs, especially if someone did it more than once. Miss Marple's needles were not with her now. but her fingers moved slightly as though she were still knitting the thread of thought. "The window bolt," she said quietly. "Could the bolt be moved from outside?" Mr. Barrow shook his head at once. "Not if it is a proper internal bolt. But marks on the wood could come from something rubbing, or from a cord. If a person tried to slide something thin between sash and frame." "A cord," Miss Marple repeated. He looked uncertain. "You are asking a great many questions, Miss Marple." "I am," she agreed, "because everyone else has stopped asking." Mr. Barrow sighed. "If you had a thin wire or a stiff cord, you might move a loose bolt, not a strong one. But if it was not fully seated, or if the bolt was worn, maybe. It would be awkward." "And the door?" Miss Marple asked. "If someone left the room and wanted to lock the door behind them, and still make it look as though the key was inside. Is there any way?" Mr. Barrow frowned deeply now. "The keyhole is there. You could do the old string trick with some kinds of internal locks. But a mortise like that is different. You cannot turn a key that is not there." Miss Marple waited. He added slowly, "Unless you have another key." "Another key," Miss Marple said softly. Mr. Barrow nodded reluctantly. "Keys can be copied, if someone has access for a few minutes. A bit of wax. A quick impression. A friend in town. It happens." Miss Marple thought of the letter. The nephew. The talk of changing the will. The fear of being made to sign something. "Would a copied key work perfectly?" she asked. Mr. Barrow shook his head. "Not always. Depends on the skill. It may scrape a little. It may leave marks. It may stick." Miss Marple's mind returned to the scuffs around the keyhole, the faint scuffing that looked newer than the rest. She thanked Mr. Barrow and rose. At the door, he stopped her. "Miss Marple, yes." He looked uncomfortable. "If someone did use a thin strip to fool the eye through the keyhole, it would be a bold trick. It would rely on panic and certainty. People would need to want the lock to prove innocence." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People want many things, especially after death." She walked home through the twilight. The village lamps were beginning to glow, soft circles of light on the road. Curtains lit up one by one. Homes became small warm boxes, each holding its own secrets. Miss Marple paused at the corner where she could see Willow End in the distance. Upstairs, the room window was dark now, but the outline of it seemed to stare back, locked from the inside. It was such a comforting phrase. It was the sort of phrase that allowed everyone to stop thinking. But Miss Marple had not lived as long as she had by accepting comfort in place of truth. The room at Willow End had not refused to speak. It had spoken very clearly. It said, "Look here, not there." It said, "Believe the lock." It said, "Do not notice the fold in the rug, the angle of the chair, the marks beside the bolt, the scuffs at the keyhole." It said, "Stop asking." And that, Miss Marple thought as she stepped into the lamplight, was always the moment when one must begin. Chapter 4. The day the nephew arrived, the village behaved as though it had been expecting him all along. Not because anyone had been counting the hours, but because certain stories required certain characters. A locked room felt incomplete without an heir. A quiet death felt unfinished without a face to stand at the graveside and accept condolences with the correct expression. Miss Marple watched the arrival from her window as she drank her tea. The black car turned into the lane and slowed at the bend as though it were reluctant to bring its passenger too close to the place where gossip could touch it. It stopped outside Willow End, and a man stepped out, tall, well-dressed, and carefully arranged. He did not look like grief. He looked like decision. Within minutes, people began to mention his name in low voices, as if saying it too loudly might invite him to hear what they were thinking. Edward Hawthorne. The nephew. The one who lived in town. The one who wrote letters. The one who was charming. Miss Marple finished her tea, put on her coat, and walked toward the green. At the post office, she found Mrs. Finch already there, lips pursed, eyes bright with restrained excitement. Mrs. Finch had the kind of curiosity that rarely slept. "He has come," Mrs. Finch murmured, as if announcing weather. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Very handsome," Mrs. Finch added, with the faint disapproval of someone who believed attractiveness was suspicious. "And very polite. He carried his own bag, you know, as though he wanted us to see." Miss Marple's mouth softened. "He wanted you to see something, certainly." Mrs. Finch leaned closer. "Do you think he will inherit?" Mr. Hawthorne had money. Not endless money, but enough. People are saying there might be changes. A new will. Something signed. Miss Marple's eyes remained calm. "People say many things, yes," Mrs. Finch said, and her voice grew hushed with satisfaction. "But this time people might be right." Miss Marple left the post office with a small packet of stamps she did not need. She walked slowly past the shop windows, letting the village air and village whispers settle around her. By midday, she found her opportunity. The vicar had arranged for tea to be served at the church hall, for those who wished to support Mrs. Linton and the coming funeral arrangements. In villages, support often came in the shape of cups and plates. People did not always know how to offer kindness with words, but they knew how to pour tea. Miss Marple arrived to find the hall already filling. The smell of baking drifted through the room. The vicar's wife moved between tables with the air of a general organizing a small domestic campaign. At the far end, near the window, Edward Hawthorne stood speaking with the vicar. He smiled at the right moments. He nodded as though he were listening, but his gaze flickered now and then toward the door as though watching for someone else to arrive. When he noticed Miss Marple, his expression shifted. The smile remained, but something behind it tightened. Like a string drawn slightly more taut, he approached with practiced ease. "Miss Marple," he said, and the way he said it suggested he had already been told who she was and what she might represent. "I am Edward Hawthorne. My uncle spoke of you once. He said you had a sharp mind." Miss Marple's eyes were gentle. "Your uncle spoke kindly of many people." Edward laughed softly. He was not known for kindness, not in town anyway. "That is because town people often mistake quietness for coldness," Miss Marple replied. Edward's smile widened a fraction, appreciating her tone. "You are very perceptive." Miss Marple did not respond to that. Compliments were often tools. She had seen men use them like keys. "I am so sorry for your loss," she said simply. His eyes lowered, a controlled gesture. "Thank you. It was a shock." He was. Difficult at times, but he was still family. Miss Marple nodded. "Family can be the most difficult thing we inherit." Edward chuckled, then sighed. "I wish I had been here sooner." But he did not want me. He liked to keep his life sealed. The word sealed floated between them for a moment. Miss Marple noticed it. "Yes," she said softly. "Sealed." Like a room locked from the inside, Edward's eyelids flickered slightly, so quickly most people would never have noticed. But Miss Marple did. "Yes," he said. "Quite extraordinary." Constable said there was no possibility of foul play. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Possibilities do not always announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive quietly." Edward watched her, still smiling, but now the smile had the quality of caution. "I understand you were at the house," he said. "I visited Mrs. Linton," Miss Marple replied. "She has served your uncle for many years." Edward's expression softened. Poor woman. Must be dreadful for her. Living in that house with memories. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Yes. And routines. Routines are powerful. They can hide a great deal." Edward laughed gently, as though it were a witty remark rather than a serious observation. "You speak like someone who has lived a long time." "I have," Miss Marple said. A tray of tea passed between them. Edward took a cup. His hands were steady. His fingers were clean. His nails trimmed. He looked like a man who disliked mess. "Tell me," Miss Marple said, "when was the last time you saw your uncle?" Edward's eyes remained open. Innocent. "Christmas. We exchanged letters since. He rarely traveled. He never liked leaving the village." "And the letters," Miss Marple asked, "were they friendly?" Edward smiled. "As friendly as he could be. He had his moods, and yours," Miss Marple said gently. Edward laughed again. "Mine were always polite. I tried to be patient. He was stubborn about certain matters." "What matters?" Edward's smile tightened. "Old things. Money. Property. Wills. You know how older people can become. They cling." Miss Marple's eyes remained steady. "Yes. They cling. Especially when they are frightened." Edward's gaze flickered again. "Frightened." Miss Marple nodded faintly. "Mrs. Linton said he was uneasy. That he feared being made to sign something." Edward's laugh came too quickly. "Oh dear. That sounds like my uncle. He always imagined people were after him. Paranoia runs in some families." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "Paranoia can be an insult people use when they do not wish to examine a fear." Edward looked at her cup, then back at her. "You think he had reason to fear?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think he believed he did. And people often behave as though their fears are true, whether they are or not." A woman approached then with a plate of biscuits. The interruption was small, but useful. Edward thanked the woman with charm, and the village watched him do it. Charm was a public performance. He knew it, and so did Miss Marple. When the woman moved away, Miss Marple spoke again, quietly. "Your uncle kept his door locked at night." Edward shrugged. "So I have heard. And he bolted his windows. Old habits." "Yet habits change," Miss Marple said gently. "You said he was stubborn." "Stubborn people do not change habits without a reason." Edward's smile stayed in place, but his eyes hardened, just slightly. "You are suggesting something," he said. Miss Marple shook her head. "I am only listening to what the village is saying. And to what the room is saying." Edward leaned closer, voice still polite. "I would advise you, Miss Marple, not to make a tragedy worse with imagination. My uncle is gone. Mrs. Linton has suffered enough. The village does not need scandal." Miss Marple's tone remained calm. "Truth is not scandal. It is only truth." Edward's smile returned to full brightness as the vicar called for attention, and people turned to listen. He stepped away as though the conversation had been perfectly pleasant. Miss Marple watched him go. He moved like a man who had practiced being loved. And yet, beneath that practice, there was something else. A desire to close a door quickly. That evening, the sky deepened into a slow gray dusk, and St Aldwyn lit its lamps as if trying to hold back questions. Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting, but her mind was not in the wool. It was in Willow End, in that upstairs room, in the fold of the rug and the scuffed keyhole, in the stopped clock at 6:20. She heard footsteps outside, and then a knock. This time it was firm, not hesitant. That firmness belonged to someone who believed they had the right to knock. When she opened the door, Edward Hawthorne stood there with his hat in his hand. The lamplight caught his face and softened it, making him look almost sincere. "Miss Marple," he said, "I hope I am not disturbing you." "Not at all," she replied, stepping aside. "Come in." He entered as though he were stepping into a room he had already imagined. He looked around with quick, assessing glances. The neatness, the books, the small ornaments. He was measuring her. Miss Marple poured tea without asking. People like Edward always accepted tea. It allowed them to feel in control of the pace of the conversation. He sat and crossed one leg over the other with ease. "I wanted to speak privately," he said. "Yes. I realize I may have sounded abrupt earlier. It has been a difficult few days. I quite understand, Miss Marple said. He sighed and leaned forward, hands clasped, a posture designed to appear open. My uncle's affairs are complicated. There will be paperwork, people in town, solicitors, and then there is the funeral. I would like things to proceed quietly. Of course, Miss Marple said. Edward hesitated. There are those in the village who enjoy stories. I would prefer they did not grow. Miss Marple's needles moved, a steady click, like a clock that refused to stop. Stories grow when there is something left untold, she said. Edward smiled faintly. You are very wise. Miss Marple did not respond. She continued knitting. Edward cleared his throat. My uncle kept himself apart, as you know, but I cared for him. Despite everything, I would not want his memory harmed by gossip. And yet, Miss Marple said softly, you mentioned wills and property rather quickly, for a man in grief. Edward's eyes sharpened, but his voice remained polite. I am being practical. Practicality is necessary. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Practicality is often necessary. Tell me, Mr. Hawthorne, did you know your uncle had replaced the latch on his bedroom door last winter? Edward blinked. No, Mr. Barrow fitted it, Miss Marple continued gently. A new latch. Old lock. But something had been sticking. Edward's smile became more careful. Interesting. And did you ever have access to your uncle's keys? Miss Marple asked. Edward laughed lightly. No. He would not trust anyone with his keys. Not even his housekeeper, Miss Marple said. Edward's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Linton, yes, he shrugged. She is loyal, I am sure. But loyalty can be purchased with wages. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Or with fear. Edward's laughter stopped. He studied her now, not smiling. You think Mrs. Linton is afraid? I think she has lived in that house 15 years, Miss Marple replied. She knows how to protect herself. Edward leaned back, fingers tapping his knee. Miss Marple, you are implying there is more here than a natural death. I find that unhelpful. Miss Marple set her knitting down for the first time. She looked at him steadily. What time did you arrive in the village today? She asked. Edward blinked again, thrown by the directness. Late morning. Just after 11. And where were you before that? In town. Which town? He smiled, annoyed now. Really, Miss Marple? Miss Marple did not raise her voice. She did not need to. I am an old woman, she said softly. Old women ask questions. It is one of the few entertainments left to us. Edward's expression shifted into a practiced charm again. Very well. I was in Norwich. I stayed overnight. Then I drove here. And did anyone see you in Norwich? Edward's jaw tightened. Yes, people saw me. Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied. Then she asked, did you write to your uncle recently asking him to change his will? Edward's smile vanished entirely. That is a private matter. It is, Miss Marple said. But private matters often become public when someone dies behind a locked door. Edward stared at her for a long moment. The room felt suddenly smaller, as though the walls had leaned inward to listen. Finally he spoke, voice low. My uncle was stubborn. He refused to consider sensible arrangements. I wanted him to make things simple. For everyone. Everyone, Miss Marple repeated. Yes. Mrs. Linton would have been cared for. The house could have been sold. Funds distributed properly. Instead, he clung to everything like a miser. Miss Marple's eyes remained gentle. Clinging is sometimes the last defense of a frightened man. Edward leaned forward. What do you want, Miss Marple? Miss Marple blinked slowly. I want the truth. That is all. Edward's mouth tightened. Truth. The doctor said heart failure. The doctor examined a body, Miss Marple replied. He did not examine a room. Edward's gaze flickered toward her mantel clock. It was ticking steadily. What does the room tell you? he asked, voice edged with mockery. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It tells me your uncle did not drink his tea. It tells me his bed was untouched. It tells me the rug outside the door was nudged repeatedly. It tells me the lock has fresh scuffs. It tells me someone wanted the door to be the story, so no one looked elsewhere. Edward's face had gone still. Too still. A polite mask hardened into something cold. You have no proof, he said quietly. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Proof is a strange thing. People think it comes like a thunderclap. Often it comes like knitting. One small loop after another. And then suddenly you have a shape. Edward stood abruptly, the chair legs scraped softly against the floor. This is inappropriate, he said. Miss Marple rose as well, not hurried. Is it? Edward's eyes flashed. My uncle is dead. You are implying murder without evidence. Do you know what that could do? Yes, Miss Marple said gently. It could make someone very uncomfortable. Edward's hand clenched around his hat. For a moment, the charm slipped, and she saw the strain beneath it. The man who needed control. The man who did not like doors left open. Then he forced a smile again. I apologize, he said. Grief makes me short-tempered. Miss Marple nodded politely. It does. Edward moved toward the door, then paused. Do be careful, Miss Marple, he said softly. Villages can be cruel. People can turn on someone quickly. Especially an old woman with imagination. Miss Marple looked at him with mild sadness. Imagination is not my danger, Mr. Hawthorne. Certainty is. He stared at her a moment longer, then left. When the door closed, Miss Marple remained standing for a while, listening to the fading sound of his steps. Outside, the village lamps glowed warmly. Curtains drew shut. Doors locked. Bolts slid into place. Miss Marple returned to her chair and picked up her knitting again. The needles clicked softly in the quiet room. Edward Hawthorne had come to her house not to be comforted. He had come to close something. To lock it. But a locked door did not frighten Miss Marple. It only told her where someone did not want her to look. And now she knew, with a calm certainty of her own, that the most important part of this mystery had happened before anyone ever saw the body. Not in the room, but in the night before. Chapter 5. The morning after Edward Hawthorne's visit arrived quietly, as if the village itself were reluctant to disturb what had been said behind closed doors. Mist lay low across the green, softening the edges of cottages and hedges, making everything appear less certain than it had the day before. Miss Marple liked mornings like this. They reminded people that clarity was earned, not given. She sat at her small table with a cup of tea growing cold beside her, and her knitting resting untouched in her lap. For once, she was not knitting. She was thinking. What troubled her was not the locked door. That part had already begun to untangle itself in her mind. What troubled her was timing. Timing was the silent partner of every deception. People could lie about actions, but time had a habit of exposing them. The clock in Mr. Hawthorne's room had stopped at 6:20. Everyone had accepted this as a minor detail. Miss Marple did not. Clocks stopped for reasons, sometimes mechanical, sometimes human. She rose and put on her coat. Her first visit was to Mrs. Peters, who lived opposite Willow End and possessed the sort of memory that was excellent for other people's habits, but unreliable for her own. Mrs. Peters welcomed her eagerly, almost gratefully, as though she had been waiting for someone to ask her to remember. You were awake early the morning Mr. Hawthorne died, Miss Marple said, settling into the chair by the window. Mrs. Peters nodded at once. I always am. My joints do not allow me much rest. Did you hear anything unusual? Mrs. Peters frowned. No, nothing loud. No shouting. No struggle. That is why everyone says it must have been natural. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. But did you hear anything ordinary? Mrs. Peters blinked. Ordinary footsteps. Doors. A kettle, a clock chiming. Mrs. Peters' brow creased. Well, now you mention it. I did hear something. The back gate at Willow End. It creaks, you know. Always has. Miss Marple's eyes lifted slightly. What time was that? Mrs. Peters hesitated. I am not certain. It was still dark. Before 7. Because I remember thinking Mrs. Linton would not be up yet. Could it have been around 20 past 6? Mrs. Peters nodded slowly. Yes, that sounds right. I remember because the church bell had not rung, and my radio had not come on yet. And what did you think it was? I assumed it was Mrs. Linton, Mrs. Peters said. She sometimes goes out early to shake rugs or take rubbish round the side. I did not think more of it. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Ordinary sounds are often the most important. She thanked Mrs. Peters and walked slowly down the lane. The mist was lifting now, revealing the familiar outlines of the village. As things became clearer, she felt her thoughts sharpening. Her next stop was Mr. Ellis's shop, not for gossip this time, but for precision. Good morning, Mr. Ellis, she said. Morning, Miss Marple. Still thinking about that business. I am thinking about clocks, she replied. Mr. Ellis chuckled. Aren't we all? Your shop clock, Miss Marple said. Does it keep good time? Mr. Ellis glanced at it instinctively. Always has. I set it by the radio. And was it working the morning Mr. Hawthorne died? Yes, I remember because I opened early. 6:30. I had deliveries. And did you hear the church bell? No, Mr. Ellis said. It rang late that morning. Something wrong with the rope, I think. Miss Marple nodded. She had suspected as much. She left the shop and stood for a moment on the pavement, letting the pattern settle. At 20 past 6, the clock in Mr. Hawthorne's room stopped. At around the same time, Mrs. Peters heard the back gate. Before 7, before the tea tray was placed outside the door. Miss Marple felt the gentle click in her mind as one thread slid neatly into place. She returned home briefly, took her notebook, and then went to Willow End. The constable was there again, collecting paperwork. He looked relieved when he saw her, as though her presence meant he was not alone with uncertainty. Constable, she said kindly, may I ask you something? Of course, Miss Marple. Did you examine the clock mechanism? He hesitated. No. It did not seem relevant. Would you mind if we did? He looked uncertain, then nodded. I suppose not. They went upstairs. The room was emptier now. The undertaker had removed most of Mr. Hawthorne's belongings. The chair remained. The rug remained. The door remained. Miss Marple picked up the clock carefully. She turned it over. The spring is intact, she said. It did not run down. The constable leaned closer. What stopped it then? Miss Marple pointed gently. This. A small obstruction. Something wedged briefly into the mechanism. It could be removed easily. The constable frowned. Like what? Like a thin strip of metal, Miss Marple said. Or even a folded paper clip. The constable straightened. Why would anyone stop the clock? Miss Marple looked toward the door. To create a time. 20 past 6. A moment people would remember. A moment they could anchor their assumptions to. The constable swallowed. You think the death did not happen then? I think the room wants us to believe it did. She moved to the bed. This bed was not slept in. You can see that clearly now that most things are gone. The constable nodded slowly. You are right. And the tea, Miss Marple continued. He never drank it. Which means he was not alive to take it. Or not in the room. The constable's face paled slightly. You are saying he was already dead? No, Miss Marple said calmly. I am saying he was already gone. She turned to the window. Someone left that room before morning. Quietly. Carefully. Locking it behind them, the constable shook his head. But the key? Miss Marple smiled faintly. The key is the easiest part of the story to manipulate when people are already frightened. She stepped toward the door, pointed to the scuffed metal, a copied key. Used quickly. Removed. And then a thin strip placed in the keyhole to cast a shadow. Mrs. Linton saw what she expected to see. Panic does the rest. The constable stared at the door, as though seeing it for the first time. And Mrs. Linton, he said slowly. She was involved. Miss Marple's expression softened, not in murder, in protection. She believed she was protecting herself. And perhaps the house. The constable exhaled slowly. And Mr. Hawthorne. Miss Marple nodded. He was frightened. He knew someone was pressuring him. He did not sleep in that room that night. He sat in the chair until someone arrived. The constable whispered, "The nephew." Miss Marple did not answer. She did not need to. The room had spoken. The clock had spoken. The village had spoken. All that remained was for the truth to be said aloud. By late afternoon, the village was humming with a different kind of energy. It was not gossip this time, but anticipation. People sensed when a story was about to change direction. The air grew tense, like the moment before rain. Miss Marple sat once more in her sitting room, waiting. The knock came as she expected it would. This time it was the constable, and behind him, Edward Hawthorne. Edward's face was composed, but the effort showed now. His charm had thinned, like paint stretched too far. "Miss Marple," the constable said, "we need to speak." "Of course," she replied. Edward stepped inside without waiting to be invited. He looked around again, but this time there was irritation in his glance, not assessment. "I understand you have been telling stories," he said. Miss Marple sat. "I have been telling the truth." Edward laughed sharply. "You have no proof." Miss Marple folded her hands. "You arrived the night before your uncle's death." Edward's smile faltered. "That is ridiculous." "You came late," she continued. "You entered by the side gate. Mrs. Peters heard it. You went to your uncle's room." Edward's jaw tightened. "You cannot prove that." "You argued with him," Miss Marple said softly. "He refused to sign. He was frightened. He locked the door." Edward snapped. He was old and paranoid. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "And you used that." The constable stepped forward. "Mr. Hawthorne, where were you between 6 and 7 that morning?" Edward's voice rose. "In Norwich." "I told you." Miss Marple looked at him gently. "The hotel clerk says otherwise. You checked out at dawn. Your car was seen on the road by a farmer before 6. Edward's breath caught. "Just for a moment. You returned to the house," Miss Marple continued. "Your uncle was already weak. The argument finished him. Not with violence. With fear." Edward whispered, "I did not touch him." "No," Miss Marple said. "You did not have to. You left him there. You staged the room. You stopped the clock. You locked the door to make the room the story." Edward sank into the chair. His hands trembled now. "I only wanted him to sign," he said hoarsely. "I did not mean for him to die." Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost kind. "Intent does not erase consequence." The constable placed a hand on Edward's shoulder. As Edward was led away, the village bells began to ring properly at last. Clear. On time. Miss Marple watched from her window as the black car drove away, carrying the truth with it. At Willow End, the door would be unlocked now. And the village would learn, slowly and quietly, that the most dangerous locks were not made of metal at all. They were made of certainty. Chapter 6. The morning of the funeral arrived without drama, as though the village wished to show its respect by remaining perfectly ordinary. The sky was pale and undecided. A thin wind moved along the hedges, lifting leaves and setting them down again without commitment. St Aldwyn had reached the stage of grief where silence felt preferable to explanation. Miss Marple stood at her window and watched the first people make their way toward the church. Black coats. Careful steps. faces arranged into expressions suitable for public sorrow. She noticed how many of them glanced toward Willow End as they passed, as though the house itself might offer a final word. The door at Willow End was no longer locked. It stood closed, but not sealed. That difference mattered. Miss Marple put on her coat and hat and walked slowly toward the church. She did not hurry. Truth, once spoken, did not need to chase anyone. Inside the church, the air held the faint scent of polish and old hymn books. People filled the pews quietly. There was no crowding, no jostling. Everyone knew their place. Villages were good at that. Mrs. Linton sat near the front, hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked smaller than she had before, as though the weight she had carried for years had finally pressed down upon her. Her eyes flicked toward Miss Marple as she entered, and for a moment there was something like gratitude there. Or perhaps relief. The vicar stood at the lectern, his voice steady, his words careful. He spoke of Miss Hawthorne as a man of routine and principle, a man who valued privacy, a man who lived quietly and died quietly. Miss Marple listened without interruption. Funerals were not the place for corrections. When the service ended, people lingered as they always did, reluctant to be the first to return to normal life. Murmurs rose softly. Condolences were exchanged. Tea was mentioned. Outside, the constable stood near the gate. His uniform looked slightly less stiff than it had a few days earlier. He met Miss Marple's gaze and gave her a small nod. Nothing official. Nothing public. Just acknowledgement. Mrs. Linton approached Miss Marple hesitantly once most people had moved away. "I wanted to thank you," she said, voice low, "for what you did." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "I did very little." Mrs. Linton's hands twisted together. "You listened. And you noticed. That is more than most." She hesitated, then added, "I was wrong to hide things. I thought I was protecting myself. And the house. I did not realize how much worse it would become." Miss Marple's eyes were kind. Fear makes people tidy lies into neat shapes. They feel safer that way. Mrs. Linton swallowed. "Will people forgive me?" "They will," Miss Marple said calmly. "Villages forget slowly, but they forgive quietly. You will continue. You always have." Mrs. Linton nodded, as though clinging to the certainty of that. As Miss Marple walked away from the church, she noticed that the air had changed. The tension that had gripped the village had loosened. People spoke a little more freely, their shoulders lowered. The story had reached its ending, and endings were a relief, even when they were sad. She walked past Willow End once more. The curtains were open now. Light moved through the rooms again. The house no longer seemed to be holding its breath. Miss Marple paused at the gate and looked up at the upstairs window. The room was just a room again, not a puzzle, not a warning. Just a place where something had happened. She turned away and continued home. In the days that followed, St Aldwyn settled back into its familiar rhythms. Shops opened and closed. The bus passed through without stopping. The church bell rang on time again. Life resumed its careful pattern, though not quite unchanged. Edward Hawthorne's name was spoken less and less. When it was mentioned, it was with a faint tightening of voices, as though people preferred not to think too closely about how charm could sit so comfortably beside pressure, or how politeness could be used as a tool. Miss Marple returned to her routines. She knitted by the window. She walked the lanes. She listened. One afternoon, Mrs. Peters stopped by with a basket of apples. "I cannot stop thinking about that door," Mrs. Peters said, setting the basket down. "All of us were so certain. We said it again and again, locked from the inside, as though that settled everything." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Certainty is a very tempting thing." "Yes," Mrs. Peters said thoughtfully. It saves one the trouble of wondering. And wondering, Miss Marple replied, is often where the truth waits. Mrs. Peters nodded slowly, as though filing the thought away for later use. A week later, the constable visited once more. This time his manner was lighter. The tension had left him. They will be transferring the case, he said. Everything is settled now. Miss Marple nodded. I am glad. He hesitated at the door. You know, Miss Marple, I nearly missed it. All of it. The clock, the rug, the keyhole. I wanted the door to be the answer. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. Doors often ask us not to look elsewhere. He smiled, embarrassed. I will remember that. After he left, Miss Marple returned to her chair and picked up her knitting. The needles moved steadily, looping yarn into something useful and complete. As the afternoon faded, she reflected on the quiet lesson the village had learned. The locked door had not been a trick of clever engineering. It had been a trick of belief. People wanted it to mean safety. They wanted it to mean that no one they knew could have done harm. So they accepted it without question. But truth rarely announced itself with certainty. It arrived quietly, in ordinary sounds, in small details, in the spaces between routine and habit. That evening, Miss Marple walked one last time past Willow End. The side gate was closed now, but not locked. The hedge stood still. The upstairs window reflected the fading light. She did not stop this time. The mystery had been resolved, but the lesson would remain. Rooms remembered. Houses remembered. Villages remembered. And doors, whether locked or open, always told the truth to those willing to listen. Miss Marple returned home as dusk settled. She lit her lamp and sat by its warm glow, content in the knowledge that balance had been restored, quietly and without spectacle. Outside, St Aldwyn breathed easily again, and somewhere in the village a door closed for the night. Not in fear, but in peace. The village of St Aldwyn returned to its gentle ways, carrying the memory quietly, as villages always do. Willow End stood calm again, its rooms ordinary, its doors no longer burdened with meaning. Miss Marple watched life resume from her window, aware that nothing truly returns unchanged. People had learned that certainty can mislead, and that truth often hides in what feels familiar. She picked up her knitting, satisfied not with triumph, but with balance restored. The mystery faded into routine, leaving behind a soft awareness that even the most ordinary door, once questioned, can teach a village how to see more clearly.